In 1982, the world scoffed at a slow British jet. It couldn't break the sound barrier. Its radar was a generation behind. It carried 2 missiles when American fighters carried 8. Argentina's military planners looked at it and called it, their words, preserved in post-war analysis published by the Marine Corps University, an insignificant threat to the British task force. 10 weeks later, it had a perfect air-to-air combat record. 20 kills, 0 losses. And every air force on Earth wanted one. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The people who flew this aircraft, the pilots who strapped into its cockpit, the ground crews who patched it back together on freezing flight decks at 3 in the morning, they had their own name for it. Not a name of pride, a name that'll make sense later when the triumph fades and the real cost comes into focus. A name of fear. This is the Harrier story that should have been told a long time ago. The Harrier exists because of one radical idea and one extraordinary engine. In the late 1950s, a team at Hawker Aircraft, led by Sir Sydney Camm and engineer Ralph Hooper, started chasing a concept most of the aviation world called impossible. A jet that could take off and land vertically, no runway required. What made it work was the Bristol Siddeley Pegasus, designed by Sir Stanley Hooker, an engine with 4 exhaust nozzles, 2 on each side of the fuselage, that could rotate from pointing backward for conventional flight to pointing straight down for vertical lift. Nothing else like it existed anywhere on Earth. On 21st of October 1960, the experimental P1127 prototype made its first tethered hover at Dunsfold Aerodrome in Surrey. The ugly thing just lifted, straight up. No runway, no catapult, no wire. It evolved through the Kestrel evaluation program, where American, British and German pilots all took turns testing the concept, into the Harrier GR1, entering RAF service in 1969 with No. 1 Squadron. A decade later, the Royal Navy got its own version, the Sea Harrier FRS-1, joining the fleet in 1980 aboard the new Invincible-class carriers. Barely 2 years old when it was called to fight the most important British air war since 1945. So why didn't anyone take it seriously? Start with the numbers. The Sea Harrier's top speed was 735 miles per hour, Mach 0.97, fractionally below the speed of sound. In a world where the American F-15 Eagle could hit Mach 2.5 and Argentina's Mirage 111S could exceed Mach 2, the Sea Harrier looked like a relic from another era. Its Blue Fox radar was a basic pulse system that struggled badly in look-down scenarios. A full generation behind the pulse Doppler sets fitted to American and Soviet frontline fighters. For air-to-air combat, it carried 2 Sidewinder missiles. 2. The F-15 carried 8 in mixed configurations. NATO exercises throughout the late 1970s told the whole story without anyone needing to say it out loud. Allied pilots in their supersonic machines regarded the Harrier the way you'd regard a clever magic trick. Fascinating at an air show. Surely not something you'd stake a war on. And the skepticism wasn't just foreign. It came from inside the house. Defense Secretary John Nott's 1981 Defense White Paper proposed selling HMS Invincible to the Royal Australian Navy and effectively downsizing the Fleet Air Arm's fixed-wing capability. The Sea Harrier was seen across Whitehall as a poor man's substitute for the Phantoms and Buccaneers the Royal Navy had been forced to surrender in the 1970s. The admirals who believed in this aircraft were fighting their own government for its survival, and they were losing. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2nd, 1982, the Sea Harrier was an aircraft living on borrowed time. Deployed on carriers scheduled for sale or decommission, armed with missiles only recently supplied by the Americans, universally underestimated by friends and enemies alike. And that's when everything changed. The British task force sailed from Portsmouth on the 5th of April, 3 days after the invasion, carrying the most improbable air component ever sent to fight a modern war. HMS Hermes, the ageing flagship, embarked 12 Sea Harrier FRS.1s of 800 Naval Air Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld. HMS Invincible, newer and smaller, carried 8 Sea Harriers of 801 Naval Air Squadron under Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward, a man whose name would become synonymous with this air war, and whose personality, brilliant, combative, unapologetically self-promoting, would generate controversy for decades after. 20 aircraft. That was it. 20 Sea Harriers to provide air defence for an entire naval task force operating 8,000 miles from home against an Argentine air force capable of putting 82 combat aircraft into the sky from mainland bases. The arithmetic was terrifying. Lose a handful in the opening engagements and the task force would be left naked. No air cover, war over, ground troops never setting foot on the islands. The carriers themselves introduced a problem that gets overlooked. Both Hermes and Invincible were small ships by supercarrier standards. Nothing like the American Nimitz-class behemoths with their steam catapults and 4-acre flight decks. They had no catapults at all. What they had instead was a ski jump ramp, a curved ramp at the bow that launched Sea Harriers into the air on an upward trajectory, trading some of the aircraft's own thrust for extra altitude and lift during the critical first seconds after leaving the deck. The physics mattered enormously. A flat-deck rolling takeoff would have forced Sea Harriers to leave the ship heavy with fuel but light on weapons, or armed but short on range. The ski jump changed that equation. By kicking the aircraft upward, it allowed pilots to get airborne carrying more fuel and more ordnance than a flat deck would ever permit at those ship speeds. It was a peculiarly British solution. Elegant, unglamorous, and born from making do with less. And it would prove essential when every sidewinder and every extra minute of patrol time counted. Reinforcements were scraped together from wherever they could be found. 809 Naval Air Squadron was hastily stood up from training and reserve aircraft. And then came the container ship. The Atlantic Conveyor was a container ship, a merchant vessel built to haul commercial freight across the Atlantic, not to serve as an aircraft transport in a shooting war. Within days of requisition by the Ministry of Defence, she was transformed into something that had no real name, because nothing like it had existed before. Welding crews worked around the clock to add helicopter landing pads. Sea Harriers and RAF Harrier GR3s were loaded onto her open deck and lashed down with chains and tie-down points improvised from whatever the dockyard could fabricate in time. She had no armoured flight deck, no firefighting foam systems designed for aviation fuel, no blast deflectors, no arresting gear. She was a cargo ship with jet fighters chained to her roof, sailing into a combat zone where Exocet missiles were already in play. The crews who worked on that deck during the voyage south operated in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable on any actual carrier. Wind, spray, corrosion eating at exposed aircraft, and the constant knowledge that a single fire among those fueled and armed jets on a ship with no flight deck suppression systems would be unsurvivable. The aircraft couldn't fly off the conveyor under normal circumstances. She had no ski jump, no proper flight deck. So the transfer to the carriers had to happen at sea in the South Atlantic, with pilots conducting vertical takeoffs from a pitching merchant vessel and vertical landings on carriers that were themselves rolling through heavy swells. Every single transfer was a white-knuckle evolution. One misjudged hover in a crosswind over that open deck, and a Sea Harrier would have gone over the side. They got every aircraft off successfully. By the end of the campaign, 28 Sea Harriers served in the combat zone, joined by 10 RAF Harrier GR3s from No. 1 Squadron. Against them stood the full weight of the Fuerza Aérea Argentina and the Argentine Navy's air arm, Dassault Mirage 1 IIEAS. Israeli-built IAI daggers, Mirage 5 derivatives that were fast, agile and combat-proven. Douglas A-4 Skyhawks, flown by pilots with a reputation for raw, reckless courage. No serious analyst gave the British air component better than even odds. The first air combat came on May 1st, 1982, and it announced the Sea Harrier's intentions with savage clarity. That morning, Sea Harriers from 800 NAS struck the airfield at Stanley, while aircraft from 801 NAS flew combat air patrol over the islands. Argentine Mirage 3 EAS scrambled to intercept, climbing out from the mainland bases and racing east over open water toward the task force. Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton, an RAF exchange pilot serving with 801 NAS aboard Invincible, picked up a contact on his Blue Fox radar. A Mirage 3, inbound, fast. Barton manoeuvred to intercept, acquired the Argentine jet visually against the grey South Atlantic sky, and locked an AIM-9L Sidewinder. He pressed the firing button. The missile dropped away from the pylon, its rocket motor ignited, and it streaked across the gap between the two aircraft in seconds. The Mirage disintegrated. Barton had scored the Sea Harrier's first kill of the war, and the weapon that did it, the all-aspect Lima Sidewinder, had just rewritten the rules of aerial combat, 8,000 miles from the factory that built it. Minutes later, Lieutenant Steve Thomas of 801 NAS scored another Mirage kill. By the end of that first day, multiple Argentine aircraft had been destroyed in air-to-air engagements. Not a single Sea Harrier was scratched. The pattern held. 6 weeks. Every day, the same result. The Sea Harriers, outnumbered and subsonic, systematically destroyed every Argentine aircraft that challenged them in the air. The peak came on 21st May, the day British forces stormed ashore at San Carlos Water. This was the amphibious landing, the moment the entire war hung on, and Argentine Air Command threw everything it had at the vulnerable landing ships. Waves of daggers, Skyhawks and Mirages came screaming in low over the ridgelines of East Falkland, descending into what became known as Bomb Alley, the narrow stretch of water between the hills where British warships and transports sat exposed and largely stationary, offloading troops and supplies. The anti-aircraft fire was ferocious. Ships blazed away with everything they had. Argentine pilots flew through it anyway, at mast height, so low their aircraft threw spray off the surface. And above them, the Sea Harriers waited. Combat air patrol sorties cycled relentlessly from the carriers, and when Argentine strike packages came within range, the Sea Harriers fell on them. Sharky Ward, leading 801 NAS from Invincible, intercepted a formation of daggers heading for the anchorage. He locked a Sidewinder onto the trailing aircraft and fired. The dagger pilot never saw it. One moment he was flying, the next his aircraft was a fireball tumbling into the hills of West Falkland. Ward pulled around, searching for the next target, knowing that every Argentine aircraft he killed in the air was one less that would reach the ships below, packed with Royal Marines and paratroopers. Lieutenant Commander Mike Blissett of 800 NAS destroyed another Dagger that same day. The combat reports from that period describe engagements that lasted seconds, where the gap between life and death was the time it took a Sidewinder Seeker head to growl its lock tone. What made the San Carlos engagement so pivotal wasn't just the kills, it was the timing. Down below, in that narrow stretch of water, thousands of British troops were climbing into landing craft, wading ashore, establishing the beachhead the entire campaign depended on. Every Argentine aircraft that got through the Sea Harrier screen was a bomb heading for a ship full of soldiers. Argentine bombs found their targets. British warships in the anchorage were hit, some fatally. But the Sea Harriers above finned the Argentine waves enough that the landings held. Without them, San Carlos would have been a slaughter. Across multiple engagements on the 21st, Sea Harriers accounted for several confirmed aerial kills. The Argentine pilots were brave, sometimes insanely brave, pressing attacks through everything the task force threw at them. But the math was merciless. Every time they met Sea Harriers in the air, they died. The final count, confirmed in post-war analysis and cited by the Defence Technical Information Centre, 20 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 0 Sea Harrier losses to aerial action. Some analyses push the total to 21 or 23, depending on which claims survive scrutiny. The kills included Mirage 3 EAs, IAI Daggers, A4B and A4C Skyhawks, an English Electric Canberra bomber, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport, an Aermacchi MB-339, and a Puma helicopter caught in flight. 6 Sea Harriers were lost during the conflict, 2 to ground fire or surface-to-air missiles, 4 to operational accidents, including a mid-air collision in poor weather. But not one, not a single airframe fell to an enemy fighter. Over the war's duration, Sea Harriers flew more than 1,100 combat air patrol sorties from 2 small carriers rolling through freezing South Atlantic swells. The GR-3s added approximately 126 ground attack sorties. It was the most one-sided air-to-air result since the turkey shoots of the Pacific, achieved by the aircraft the entire world had written off. 2 things explain it. The first was the AIM-9L Sidewinder, the Lemur, supplied to Britain by the United States just before the conflict. Earlier Sidewinder variants were rear aspect only. You had to fire from behind, locked onto hot jet exhaust. The Lemur was the first truly all-aspect variant. It could acquire and track from any angle. Head-on, broadside, didn't matter. Argentine pilots had trained to defeat older Sidewinders by turning to present their cold side, and that tactic was now a death sentence. They were being killed from angles they'd been taught were safe. One analysis described the AIM-9L as Her Majesty's death ray. The vast majority of those 20 kills were Sidewinder shots, many from geometries that would have been physically impossible a year earlier. The second factor defies belief if you've never seen it. VIFF-ing, vectoring in forward flight. Picture a conventional dogfight. 2 fighters hauling around in a circle, each pulling harder, trying to get onto the opponent's tail. How tight you can turn is locked by physics. Airspeed and wing loading set hard limits. No exceptions. Unless you're flying the one aircraft on Earth with rotating engine nozzles. Now picture the Harrier pilot in that same turning fight. He reaches for the nozzle lever beside the throttle and rotates the 4 Pegasus nozzles, the same ones that allow vertical flight, partway forward, maybe 40 degrees below horizontal, maybe 60. Instantly, the thrust that was pushing the aircraft forward is now pushing partly downward and backward. The Harrier decelerates violently, far faster than any conventional fighter can manage with air brakes or throttle cut. Simultaneously, the turn radius tightens because vectored thrust is wrenching the flight path in a direction that aerodynamics alone can't achieve. To the pursuing Mirage pilot, the Sea Harrier appears to nearly stop in mid-air and pivot. He can't slow down fast enough. He overshoots, slides from the killing position behind the Harrier to the death position in front of it. And in the 2 or 3 seconds it takes him to process what just happened, the Harrier pilot has rotated the nozzles back to full aft, accelerated, and put a sidewinder into his exhaust pipe. How much VIFFing was actually used in the Falklands is genuinely debated, and the honest answer matters more than the dramatic one. Sharkey Ward himself emphasised tactical discipline, teamwork, and the sidewinder over VIFFing as the decisive factors. Some pilots said they used partial nozzle vectoring in engagements. Others said the Lima's all-aspect capability ended most fights before they reached knife-fight range. What's undeniable is that VIFFing gave Sea Harrier pilots supreme confidence in close-quarters combat, even when the missile usually finished the job first. Argentine pilots knew the Sea Harrier could do something no other fighter on Earth could do. That knowledge shaped their tactics, sapped their aggression, made them hesitate. Whether VIFFing won individual kills, or simply made those kills unnecessary by inducing caution, the effect on the air war was identical. While the Sea Harriers owned the sky, the RAF's Harrier GR3s fought an entirely different and arguably more dangerous war on the deck. The 10 GR3s from No. 1 Squadron weren't configured for dogfighting. They were ground attack jets, sent to hit Argentine positions rather than engage in air-to-air combat. These missions were appallingly hazardous. The pilots who flew those 126 ground attack sorties knew the odds every time they rolled in on a target. They flew anyway. And then there's the part of this story most accounts skip entirely, the part that's almost too cinematic. Argentine helicopter pilots operating around the Falklands flew in a state of dread that bordered on paralysis. Because the Harrier could do something that haunted their imaginations in a way no conventional fighter ever could. It could hover. Think about what that means. A normal jet is fast but predictable. It has to keep moving forward, and you can hear it coming. The Harrier, with its nozzles pointed down, could lurk behind ridgelines, behind rocky outcrops, effectively stationary, invisible to radar, waiting, like a trap with a pulse. Argentine helicopter pilots flying resupply and troop transport missions across East Falkland knew that at any moment, from behind any fold in that treeless landscape, a Sea Harrier could rise, pivot, and kill them before they had time to think. This wasn't high-altitude supersonic interception. This was a jet fighter hiding behind a rock. Sea Harriers destroyed multiple Argentine helicopters in the air and on the ground. Strikes on Goose Green Airfield on 1st of May caught several aircraft where they sat. Throughout the conflict, Argentine helicopter operations were severely restricted. Many missions pushed to darkness or foul weather, the only times the ambush odds dropped. The strategic impact reached far beyond individual helicopters destroyed. It choked Argentina's ability to resupply and reinforce its garrison across the islands, contributing directly to the eventual British victory on the ground. The VTOL capability, dismissed before the war as a circus trick, had turned the Harrier into something without precedent. A jet-powered ambush predator with the killing power of a fighter and the concealment of a helicopter. The global reaction was immediate and commercially ruthless. Before 1982, VTOL was a curiosity. After 1982, nations that had shown polite disinterest couldn't write checks fast enough. India finalized orders for the Sea Harrier FRS.51 and operated them from INS Virat, which was the former HMS Hermes, the very carrier from which 800 NAS had fought the Falklands Air War. Spain acquired the AV-8B Harrier II. Italy ordered AV-8Bs for the Marina Militare. Thailand later operated ex-Spanish Matadors from the HTMS Chakri Naruebet. The biggest shift happened in Washington. The US Marine Corps had been flying the first-generation AV-8A since the early 1970s, and the Falklands result landed like a thunderclap of validation. The AV-8B Harrier II program, a substantially redesigned second-generation aircraft developed jointly by McDonnell Douglas and British Aerospace, had been crawling through development under the usual skepticism from Air Force and Navy communities, who regarded VTOL with familiar condescension. After the Falklands, that condescension became impossible to sustain with a straight face. The AV-8B entered Marine Corps service in 1985 and became the Corps' primary light attack aircraft for 3 decades. Back in Britain, John Nott's planned sale of HMS Invincible to Australia was quietly shelved. The Sea Harrier force was enhanced and eventually upgraded to the FA2 standard with the vastly superior Blue Vixen pulse Doppler radar and AIM-120 AMR-AAM missiles. The aircraft Britain's own government had been preparing to discard became the centrepiece of Royal Navy air power for another 20 years. The Falklands didn't just vindicate the Harrier, it saved it. And now the story turns, because the documentary that ends on vindication is telling only half the truth. Remember that name? The one the people who flew and maintained this aircraft gave it? The one that wasn't born from admiration. Marines called it the Scarrier, not as a joke, as a confession. Pilots described the aircraft becoming squirrely during transition, and that word covered a multitude of terrifying moments. Marines who flew the Harrier described being scared to death during vertical operations. The transition between forward flight and hover, when the aircraft balanced on a column of thrust and a prayer. When asymmetric forces could throw the jet sideways faster than human reflexes could correct. When everything the Harrier did brilliantly in combat became everything that could kill you on a Tuesday afternoon training sortie. The first-generation AV-8A that the Marines operated earned an even grimmer name, the Lawn Dart, because that's what it looked like going in. And it went in constantly. Roughly 1/3 of all AV-8A and TAV-8A airframes delivered to the US Marine Corps were destroyed in non-combat accidents. 1/3. Not in war, not to enemy fire. Lost to the unforgiving physics of single-engine vertical flight, where engine failure during hover meant no airspeed, no altitude, no time to eject. The engineering reality was simple and merciless. Every conventional fighter has margin built into its soul. Lose an engine on a twin-engine jet and you've got another. Stall a conventional aircraft and you've got altitude to recover. The Harrier, during vertical operations, had none of that. One engine. No forward speed generating lift over the wings. If the Pegasus coughed during a vertical landing, a turbine blade cracked, a fuel controller hiccuped, anything, the pilot was sitting in a multi-ton machine that had just become a rock. The ejection seat might save you if you had enough altitude. At 50 feet in a hover, you often didn't. The crash rate across all Harrier variants was among the highest of any Western military aircraft in the jet age. Pilots died in training, died in routine operations, died doing the exact thing that made the Harrier extraordinary, the thing that won the Falklands, because that thing was inherently, structurally, permanently dangerous. Even the 4 Sea Harriers lost to operational causes during the Falklands itself tell this story. A mid-air collision in poor weather. Controlled flight into terrain in the appalling South Atlantic conditions. These weren't failures of courage or skill. They were the tax the Harrier extracted for doing what no other aircraft could do, in conditions no other aircraft was asked to endure. And then there's the story that says everything. Not an anonymous legend passed between maintainers, but a documented incident so extraordinary it became one of the most iconic moments in British naval aviation history. On the night of 7th June 1983, Sub-Lieutenant Ian "Soapy" Watson of 899 Naval Air Squadron was flying Sea Harrier Z A176 on a routine training sortie from HMS Illustrious, operating in the Atlantic. Watson lost contact with the carrier. His radio malfunctioned. His navigation systems couldn't reacquire the ship. He was alone, over open ocean, at night, in an aircraft with a finite and rapidly diminishing fuel supply. A conventional jet pilot in this situation faces a grim but straightforward calculation. Find the ship, find a diversion airfield, or eject into the sea and hope for rescue. Watson had those same options, but he also had one that no other fighter pilot on Earth possessed. He had vectoring nozzles. As fuel warnings lit up his cockpit and the darkness of the Atlantic pressed against his canopy, Watson spotted lights below. Not his carrier, a ship. It was the MV Alrigo, a Spanish-registered cargo vessel, and her deck was not a flight deck. It was a cluttered, pitching, salt-slicked container ship deck, smaller than any surface a Sea Harrier had been designed to land on, rolling in the Atlantic swell, at night, with no approach lighting, no deck crew trained in aircraft recovery, and no margin for error. Watson had minutes of fuel remaining. He made his decision. He brought the Sea Harrier into a hover over the cargo ship, the same hover that killed Marine pilots with terrifying regularity, and attempted to match the rolling deck in total darkness. What followed was not a clean arrival. Watson set the aircraft down on top of a shipping container, and as the Alrigo rolled in the swell, the Sea Harrier shifted, sliding backward. The rear fuselage slipped off the edge of the container and slammed down onto the deck below. The container partially collapsed under the impact. The jet came to rest canted and battered, its airframe crumpled where it had dropped, surrounded by buckled metal and the chaos of a cargo deck that had never been designed to absorb 9 tons of British fighter jet arriving uninvited in the middle of the night. Watson shut down the engine, climbed out of the cockpit, and found himself standing on a Spanish merchant vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Alive for no reason other than the fact that his aircraft could hover, and he had the nerve to attempt what no training manual had ever contemplated. The photographs taken afterward, a Sea Harrier sitting wrecked and incongruous among shipping containers, its nose pitched upward where the tail had dropped, the container beneath it crushed, became one of the most iconic images in British naval aviation history. Nobody cheers at a story like that. They just breathe. Because that story contains the entire Harrier in a single scene. The aircraft's unique capability, its ability to hover, to land vertically on any flat surface, is what saved Watson's life. And the terrifying fragility of that same capability, the single engine, the reaction controls, the zero margin during hover, is what nearly killed him. A few seconds of engine hesitation, a slightly mistimed descent, a gust of crosswind at the wrong moment, and Sub-Lieutenant Watson would have been another name on the Harrier's long, quiet casualty list. Instead, he became a legend. Every Harrier flight existed on that razor's edge. The Harrier demands that price, and always has. That's the Harrier. The whole truth of it held in both hands at once. 20 kills and 0 air-to-air losses. The most perfect combat record in the history of jet warfare, achieved by a subsonic aircraft the world had written off, flown from 2 small carriers in the worst weather on Earth, launched off ski jump ramps by pilots who were outnumbered 4-1 and didn't care. A ground attack jet whose pilots ejected over frozen enemy territory and walked home. An ambush predator that could hide behind a hill and terrify helicopter crews into cancelling missions. The aircraft that saved itself from the scrapyard by winning a war nobody expected it to fight. And also, an accident record that terrified the people who loved it most. A machine that punished the smallest error with death. A cockpit that brave men climbed into knowing every single time that this might be the sortie the Pegasus coughed. The pilots who won the Falklands in 1982 proved every critic wrong. The pilots who died in peacetime, trying to master a machine with no forgiveness built into its bones, proved every critic right. Both things are true. At the same time. About the same aircraft. And that contradiction, glory and terror, triumph and loss, the best combat record ever achieved in a jet that killed its own, is what makes the Harrier unlike anything else that ever flew. That's the story, the whole one, the one that should have been told a long time ago. Subscribe for more stories like this.